So in the last lesson, we talked about the basic building blocks of both HTML and CSS, as well as how to get started with Visual Studio Code. So in this lesson, we're going to go deeper on how to build web pages with HTML, how to define the structure of those pages, and how to use some of the newer semantic tags. Through this lesson, we'll talk about how to use, how to build properly structured HTML, how to use some of the newer semantic tags to organize that, as well as how to use some of the other elements and tags that are presented later in the chapter. We'll talk about how to write relative URLs, so you can refer to any file in the folder structure of your website, whether that be referring to images or CSS files and such. We'll talk about how to use the title and the meta elements in the head section of your HTML documents. You'll learn how to distinguish or how to work with both block elements and inline elements and know what some of the differences there are. We'll talk about a few different block elements, H1, H2, H3, the paragraph tag P and div, etc. We'll talk about a few inline elements, namely BR, EM, strong, span. We'll talk about how to use character codes like NBSP and copy. We'll describe some of the core attributes that you can use throughout the entire application, including ID, class, and title. There's a lot more attributes in HTML, but those are just three of the ones that are kind of most important, but you can use everywhere. We'll talk about how to use div and span tags, elements in modern HTML websites. We'll talk about how to use some of the new HTML5 semantic elements, including the header element, including header, main, footer, section, article, nav, aside, and figure. We'll talk about how to distinguish between absolute and relative URLs, and how to distinguish between what is a root relative URL and a document relative path and a root relative path. We'll distinguish between the use of, say, an anchor tag, which is a name tag, and an image element. We'll talk about some of the accessibility guidelines for both anchor tags and images. And then we'll talk about three kinds of lists that you can use with HTML5. Okay, so let's dive in. So here is a simple sort of head section. The head section has a title, and then we have this link rel fav icon. Well, this link rel shortcut icon. Here, favicon. So we're specifying a favicon or favorite icon. These are used up here. You can kind of see it in the title bar. They just need to be any sort of icon file. That's how you can add a little icon there. That helps with usability. That's one thing you can add to your web page. There's actually a website out there that will help you generate all of the resources for that if you want to do a more complete sort of setup, but that's the basic start. You create an icon file, add it to the root of your website, and then add this to your page. Okay. We may also want to include additional metadata in our head. For instance, a description. So here we have meta name description, content equals this. Technically, this needs to be all on one line to be valid HTML. However, we couldn't fit it all on one line for the purpose of the slide. But know that still needs to be one line as far as this is concerned. Typically, you can't break attribute values into more than one line. They do have to be one line. So here, that description, the importance of that description is when you go search for a web page on Google or most other search engines, so the kind of the title is used for the top part of the search result, and then the description is the text that appears underneath the search result. So let's see if I were to do a very simple example. If I were to go out to Google and say HTML tutorial, you'll see here, this is the title right here. That's the title that I'm having in my meta section. And what's underneath here, that is the description. So that's where that comes into play. Okay. These parts down here, these links, these quick links, are links that Google is pulling out and recommended. Those are not the keywords. But the keywords are also one thing you can add in there to give additional kind of information or hints to the search engine about what your website is about. Now, most modern search engines have started to completely ignore these keywords simply because they have been abused by a lot of bad actors that have put just whatever they wanted into the keywords to try and get their website up on search results. So most modern search engines now don't use your keywords basically at all to provide search results. So keep that in mind. It's still, some guides will still recommend it. This book still recommends it here, but your keywords make very little difference in your search results now. However, having a title and your description, both of those are things that show up in the actual search result, as you can see there. So those are things you want to make sure that they are actually up to date and relevant. Okay, because the user will end up seeing those. Okay. General SEO guidelines for your title tag. And remember, your title tag needs to be in the head section. Okay, so all of your pages should include a title tag in the head section. If you don't, then your page will show up as untitled or missing a title. Title should accurately reflect the content of the page. Okay. You also make sure that the title includes one or two focus keywords that you're trying to you want to be used for ranking the page. You know, what are those one or two keywords that you would like this page to come up for when the user searches for things? Those one or two keywords should definitely be in the title. The title should generally be interesting enough to entice or encourage the reader to click on it when it's shown up in the search results. So, because remember, that's the only thing they're going to see. They're going to see the title and the description, and they may not even read down to the description. They may just decide from the title. Title should generally be, well, not just generally. The title should be unique for every page on your website. That's important. Otherwise, you're missing out on a lot of potential search hits because it's like, well, all my pages have the same title, so they effectively don't get different prioritization, or your search results don't come back relevant, or the user can't tell which page they're actually being sent to. So that's what, there are many dangers with having the same title across your entire website. So make sure that you keep it unique for every page. Limit the length of your titles to around 65 characters. In reality, it's probably lower than that. Just because there's a limit to how much search engines will actually display in their results. So you do want to keep the length short enough. Each page should also have that description metadata, because remember, that's shown up in the search results. It kind of summarizes the contents of the page. Users will generally decide between the title and the description if they even want to click on that link in the search results. So between those two things, you basically have to sell the user on that they should read it. The description can be longer than the title. It doesn't have to be limited to 65 characters. There is an upper limit, as you can see with the search results. You see it's cut it off ... at some point. So there is an upper limit, but it is much higher than 65 characters. So in general, a general rule is that description should really encourage users to click on it. It should look like it's something that it should explain what's on the page and be in such a way that user with just reading that they could decide to click on it, not seeing anything else on your page. Okay. The keywords, you generally still, the general recommendation has been to include the keyword metadata on every page. You shouldn't use more than 10 keywords or phrases, 10 keywords in your metadata. And generally speaking, those keywords should be unique for each page. Okay. And the main thing to keep in mind, the title, the description, the keyword, all of those are primarily for the search engines. They're not, or the search results. They're not directly things that are, they're not things that are directly shown on your page. So just things to keep in mind. Working with block elements. So there's a few different block elements that we can use. H1, H2, all the way down to H6 represent headers of varying sizes. So an H1 is bigger than an H2, it's bigger than an H3, it's bigger than an H4, etc., all the way down to H6. That's a general rule. Your page should generally at the top have an H1 somewhere that defines the name of the tag. That should be all of your pages should have an H1 somewhere at the top. And then from there, you need to step down. So there should only ever be one H1 anywhere on the page. And then from there, you can have as many H2s as you want. Anything beneath the H2 should be H3, etc. Is really important because it does kind of give a structure to the page. It gives organization to the page. Okay. P is used for paragraphs of text. So that defines a paragraph in text. For a lot of, for most browsers, their built-in CSS style sheets will include a little bit of padding at the bottom of a paragraph as well as the bottom of any header tags. So do beware of that, or not padding, margin. It'll give some extra white space underneath it. So those are the things you have to keep in mind. You really should only use paragraph tags for paragraphs of text. So like if you're writing an article or a recipe or things like that, tutorial, that's where you should use paragraphs of text, but you shouldn't use paragraph text for just general block elements. You should only use that for paragraphs of text, the P tag. These are all block elements, which what block means is that there can only be one thing. It means a few different things, but the main thing it means is you can only have one block on a row. So if you have a block, then the next block, this H2 must be underneath that H1. The paragraph is going to be under the H2. So block means that it kind of starts a new line. That's the general default behavior. A block can also have, a block also means that it can have a border, it can have a margin, it can have padding. All things we'll talk about later as we get into CSS and the blocks and the box sizing model. But the main thing to know right now with blocks is that they define basically, they have to be vertical by default. Okay. So if we were to take that code that we just saw, throw it in, run it in the browser, it would look something like this. We've got the H1 here, we've got an H2 and an H2 here. And you'll see that the H2 is a little bit smaller than the H1, right? The H1's the biggest, H2 are next smallest, and then P is just regular text, okay? General guidelines for working with HEO. With heading tags, I talked a little bit about all this already. The heading tags are really important for the kind of showing the structure as well as the importance of content on your page. The search engines that crawl your websites absolutely pay attention to your headers. That's kind of an important thing. Always make sure that your page starts with an H1 at the top, and only include one H1. That's it. You should never have more than one H1 on a page. And then you want to make sure you're decreasing from there. Historically, people have used headings, the heading levels, as different ways to size text, or to kind of pick the level based on the size of text that they need. That's really bad from a semantic standpoint. It's really bad from an SEO standpoint, and as well as a maintenance standpoint. There are still a lot of guides out there that will tell you use this heading level or that heading level. Even there's some cases in the Bootstrap documentation itself, which we'll talk about later, that they use some of these heading levels for sizing. But really, the intent of the H1, H2 is to find structure and semantics. So if you need to change the size of a header or size of headings in general, please use CSS instead to size them using the font size property, rather than using a different H1, H2 to get the size that you want to get. Okay? That's just general good practice at this point. Okay? We can look at some more block elements here. So we have paragraph, we have a pre. Pre stands for pre-formatted. Pre-formatted is generally used with code. With a pre tag, it actually will preserve all of the white space that's there. Okay, so remember, typically any white space that exists will be discarded, will be all collapsed down to one space. If I look at how this pre-tag looks in the browser, you can see that that white space is preserved. Okay, so pre-preserves white space. Generally also will change the font to a monospaced font, which means that all the letters have the same width, which is good for when you're looking at code, which is what the pre-tag is generally used with. Not always, but often. So pre will preserve white space is another block element. There's also block quote. Okay, so block quote is used for when you're going to quote somebody else. You'll see that it's indented. It comes with indenting already styled in. But you'll also notice that the block quote does not include quote characters. The block quote does not include quotes at the beginning and the end. Okay. So that's that. We also have a p tag here, and then we have address, right? So address defines that this section here that we're showing is an address. So that allows the browser to give you nice suggestions like, oh, I can long press on that and add it to my address book, for instance. So here we have the phone number, for instance, and here we have the email address in that address section. Looking at inline elements. So inline elements don't force a break in the text. They don't force things to be on separate lines. They can be directly included inside of any block element. Okay, so inside of block element, you'll often find inline elements. So EM stands for emphasis. Strong stands for strong. The difference between these two is a little bit fuzzy. But the typical formatting of EM is usually italic, strong is usually bold. You really should not use them with that. For that, you shouldn't use strong as to be bold or use EM to be italic. What you should use them as their meaning, which is I want to emphasize this, or strong, which is I don't really understand the complete difference between, what is emphasis versus what is strong. I think strong is basically you're saying it louder, kind of thing. It's not real clear to me on what that's supposed to be, but typically that will appear in bold. Okay. KBD is short for keyboard. So that's if you want to specify a keyboard sequence that you want the user to type. So you're giving them some instructions. Sub is to make a subscript. So like here we're doing H2O. Well, the 2 should be a little and it should be down at the bottom as a subscript. And then there's also Q for quote. That's what will actually add quotes. So if we look at this here, see we've got our emphasis is making this italic. Strong is making this bold. Keyboard is making this look like a monospaced font because it's keyboard stuff. And we got a subscript here, and then we've got this in quotes. So Q here, Q there, start tag, end tag. So if you want to have a block quote that has quotes around it, then you just put a block quote and then put a Q tag inside of it. Remember, Q is an inline, so it needs to go towards the inside, and block quote is a block. So generally your blocks are going to be on the outside, and then your inlines are always going to be inside of blocks. Okay. So inline allows you to change text or change the styling of text within other text, right? So for instance, here this in the middle of H2O, I've just changed the style of that one character. Or this, I've just changed the style of Brock 21, but I didn't change the text before it or the period. Sometimes you may also want to add special characters into your code. So in that case, we use something called an entity code or an HTML entity code. Here they call it character entity. It always starts with an ampersand and sign and always ends with a semicolon. So starts with an ampersand, ends with a semicolon. In between that, there's a lot of different things you can do. It all depends on which symbol you're trying to get. So most of them have shorthand. A lot of the commonly used ones have shorthands. Some of the less commonly used ones you have to specify using a number, using the character code. So here we have right single quote. So this is going to be a right single quote that we're showing. So if we look at that, that's the quote right here. It's. Okay. So if we want to include a single quote, that's that, right single quote. Here we have a quote from John F. Kennedy, so I'm going to start with a left double quote and end with a right double quote. Okay. So here is the left double quote, and here is the right double quote. You'll notice that may seem a little bit odd. The reason we do that, however, is that if we just try to include those characters directly, oftentimes we'll get errors both with HTML as well as JavaScript. If we were to include those quote characters directly. So that's why anytime you have a single quote or a double quote, you need to use one of these entities. Okay, so you got right single quote, left single quote, left double quote, right double quote. Okay, we also in here, this paragraph is having some space introduced. So remember that space is normally collapsed in HTML. Here we're introducing a little bit of space at the beginning of this paragraph. Okay, we're doing that with this entity, NBSP, which stands for non-breaking space. That's it, non-breaking space. So what that does is it introduces a space character that it won't automatically remove. So here we've got 4 spaces. And the non-breaking part means that within that space, it won't try to break it or wrap the text to another line. So that's what that does. And that's usually generally what you want is you don't want it to wrap in the middle there. Okay. There is also a character for breaking space, but here we want non-breaking space. And again, typically that's the one we use. Copyright character, you can see at copy, and ampersand or and is at amp. So here we've got the spaces. Here we've got the copyright symbol, which is at copy, and here we've got the amp symbol, which is that ampersand. Okay, so that's symbols or entity codes, most common ones. You can look up more about these on different websites. If you look out online, all you really have to look for is HTML entity codes, and you'll get a table of all of them. Okay. Also, now that we've talked about entities, let's talk about some of the core HTML attributes. So we talked about some of these already. First one on the top of this page, you can include a language. So this takes an ISO code for the country and the language. So for English, it's going to be language-en. For Spanish, I think it's language is ES for Espanol. So you just have to look up what that character code is. I think Japanese is JA, etc., etc., etc. So every language has its own language code, but typically you want to set this to language EN for any of these English pages that we create, just for usability sakes. Okay, so language EN. In here, we can add a class. So I'm going to say this is class first because this is my first paragraph on the page. Here, I'm going to add on this p tag, I'm going to add class is first space field. Anytime you include a space in the class attribute, you're actually specifying that this tag has more than one class. So this p tag has both first and field. It has both of those classes, okay, which can be quite helpful as we go further into this semester. It's very helpful to have more than one class applied to a tag. Okay, so first and field. Then we have down this input tag has an ID email, and the title is set to enter email here. So we talked about class and ID. ID has to be unique throughout the entire page. Remember, class, you can apply the same class to more than one element across the page, and both of those things, ID and class, can be used to reference the element both in CSS as well as being able to reference it in JavaScript. The title, which we haven't seen before, the title is used as a tooltip. So if I hover over the email field now, email input, I'll see this show up. Enter email here. That's what title does. Title provides tooltips for elements in our page. Okay. General accessibility guidelines for working with some of these. You always want to include a language attribute in your HTML tag, and that should say language EN because we're dealing with English. Okay. Some other tags that we can use. These are what we call semantic tags. These were introduced as part of HTML5. What they do is they give some more hints to browsers and screen readers and other tools that may be looking at your application. Sorry, not browsers, screen readers and search engines, right? These are really helpful for search engines because it tells the search engine what kind of part of the page is this. So for instance, here we've got a header. So we're saying this part is the header or the top of the page. Main is the main content of the page, and then footer is the bottom of the page, right? So because what the search engine's typically most concerned with is what's in your main, right? Typically, most search engines can kind of ignore everything in your footer and most things in your header, and they really only care about what's in your main tag, because that's where the actual content of your website is generally. So header, main, and footer. Okay. These are all block tags. By themselves, they have no styling whatsoever. They are blocks, but they don't have any styling built in, right? So you can apply styling to the header, you can apply styling to the main, you can apply styling to the footer as you wish to, but there is none applied by default. They're just used to indicate the overall structure of your page, again, to search engines and screen readers primarily. Okay. So if we look how this page is displayed in the browser, look something like this. we've got the header that's up here. This part is our main. Here's our footer, right? So the top part is the header, the bottom part is the footer, the middle part is the main. Okay. Other semantic tags we can use include the figure tag and the figcaption. So figure defines, here's a, usually it's around an image, but it can be really anything. This is more used for academic sort of papers or tutorials, where you say, here's this figure I'm going to put in here. It may be a chart. It may be some sort of other image. Here it's code. So I've got a figure, and then so code is what I'm showing, and then beneath that I've got the caption. Okay, so this could have been an image as well, which is really the most common case. You'd have a figure, you'd have an image here, and then a caption beneath that would appear beneath the image. Or you could put the caption above it, and the caption would appear on top. So that's fig and figcaption. Okay. We can also structure our pages using div and span tags. So div and span do not have any semantic meaning or any styling out of the box, which is great. A lot of times you need a tag that doesn't mean anything. You just need to insert it to make your styling or your JavaScript work. Okay, so a div tag is your basic, this is a block. I need a block that doesn't have any specific meaning. Or a span is a tag that's a inline element, but doesn't have any sort of meaning. So what I can do is I can add the div tag here, give it an ID, and then apply my styling and my code to that ID. Add in a div, give it an ID of main, add a div, give it an ID of footer. This is used to actually how we did things. Used to be how we largely did things before the semantic tags were introduced. Before the semantic tags were introduced, we largely used div tags with IDs like this to define our headers, main content, and footer. But with the introduction of the semantic tags, we switched largely over to writing it that way instead. Div tags and span tags are still useful, but you should use, nowadays, you should use the semantic tags where they are relevant. Okay, so here we're giving ID main, ID header, ID main, ID footer. That's good, but I would still make this a header tag and a main tag and a footer tag, even if I'm applying those IDs as well. Okay, then inside of here, so I've got a span ID is equal to welcome, so I could refer to that. If we look at how that looks here, the page hasn't changed. Reason being, remember that the div and the span don't have any CSS applied by default. So if I want to change how those things look, I need to apply some CSS on top of them using either their ID or their class. Okay, so general guidelines in terms of accessibility as well as SEO when you're working with div and span. You should only use div tags when there isn't an HTML5 semantic tag that applies. Okay, so if you need a block tag that doesn't have any sort of styling, any sort of semantics, then great. But if you need, if your div tag, where you're using a div tag really a semantic tag would apply, use a semantic tag instead. Similarly with a span tag, only use it where there isn't already a semantic tag that would make more sense. Because both those, all of the semantic tags are used by the search engines to kind of figure out what's on there and kind of read your text and to rank your page in terms of their search results. So, okay. So let's talk about URL or paths. Let's talk about paths to resources. So if I'm looking at kind of a simple folder structure, maybe not so simple, but this is maybe a more real world folder structure, at least one that they have here. At the top, we have the root of the website, which really we would represent with just a single slash. Then Then beneath that, we have a few different folders. We have images, styles, we have books, we have service, and we have about. We'll notice inside of books that they have a bunch of other folders. So they're inside of books, they're creating a folder for each book that they sell. So they've got a JavaScript folder, a Java folder, a PHP folder, a C# folder, etc. Okay. So if I was going to refer to a few different pages, right, a few different resources, there's two primary kind of groupings of URLs or paths that you can use. So first of all, there are absolute URLs. So absolute URLs go all the way up to the protocol. So you got protocol, the domain name, and the path. Okay, this would be, both of these would be absolute paths because they include all of the pieces. Okay. There are also root relative paths. So root relative paths start with a slash. And that means that where you're looking for the resource is going to start with the root of the website. So if we're running it with live server, well, that would go back to localhost 5500, port 5500. Okay. So it's going to go back to the root. Well, that root is going to change based on what folder you opened in Visual Studio, right? Remember I showed you the example in one of the previous lectures where if you opened it to, say, chapter 1, you've got the chapter 1 did not show up in there, but if you opened it up to, say, homework, well, then all of those folder names underneath there are going to show. Okay, so your root relative paths are going to change based on where you open Visual Studio to, where the root of your server is. Okay, so but they're relative to your root. These have a lot of value, and that may seem like what I just said, where I said, well, it depends on where you open it. That may seem like, well, that's then subjective. Maybe it'll be more stable if I don't use root relative. Well, actually, most of the time you want to use root relative because most of the time you're going to have a fixed point where this is the root of our website. And when I refer to those resources, I want to refer to them from that root. Most of the time, that's how I refer to my resources, is using root relative. But you don't have to. You can use document relative, but I generally would use root relative and then kind of work around that. So root relative starts with a slash. Document relative do not start with a slash. So here we've got go to the images folder and dot, or go to the books folder, PHP overview.html. So these are document relative, or they're relevant relative to the path of the file that they're contained in, right? So if I am in the if I am books inside of books PHP already, this would refer to books PHP / images/logo.gif. It would be relative to where I already am, where the file already is. Same way here, this would have, if this was inside of the books PHP folder, this would refer to another step down books PHP folder. So this could then be a problem. This link might not work, okay, because this link might work just fine in the home page that's at the root of your website, but this link would not work if you're inside of, say, the jQuery book, right? So that's where I say usually links like this, especially, I would usually use a root relative path. That way it's the same everywhere I use it rather than changing from context to context. Okay. But these are useful sometimes. Okay. The other thing that you can do, document relative paths that go up. If you need to go up a directory from wherever you are, you can start with a .. Right? Now remember, if you're starting with root relative, you can't go up further than the root. The root is the top. So those are kind of mutually exclusive. If you're starting with a root relative path, you're not going to use .. to go up, typically speaking. Okay? So you can go down as such, you can go up as such, or you can just start from the root and work your way down. Okay. So some examples of this, let's say we have a link, which would be an anchor tag. href points to what page are you going to open. So I'm going to say when I click on this link, I want to open up the products.html page. The actual text of that link will be product list. Here I want to have a link to a page that's in a subfolder of the parent folder. So I look at where am I at? Well, what HTML file do I have? Am I in? We'll go up one folder, and then we'll go down to company. And then inside a company, we'll find services.html. Okay. If I wanted to do root relative, then this might look like so. I might say / go up to the root, then go down to orders, and then go to cart.html. So this would be, that link would be to the shopping cart. Okay. If I wanted to link to another web page, well, then I do have to use an absolute URL. Anytime you're referring to somebody else's website or another website, you need to use a complete absolute URL. So here we have, okay, this is going to point to http www.javascript.com, and this is official JavaScript website. That's what going to be the text of that. So that would look something like this. So we've got product list, services we provide, shopping cart, official, that. So the link looks the same way regardless of what kind of path it is, but it's going to be easier from a maintainability standpoint generally if you use I would say root relative. Again, sometimes document relative are okay, but I would generally encourage you to use root relative paths. One of the things that means, though, one thing to keep in mind, if you were to say open these files directly from your file system, root relative paths will not work, which is one of the reasons I always run them through live server. If you run them through, if you use a root relative path and you've opened it directly from your file system, those roots relative paths will point all the way up to your C directory. Instead of pointing to the kind of root of your project. So that's the thing to keep in mind. If you're using them with, say, live server, any sort of like web server, they point to the root of that web server. So let's talk about lists. So there's a few different kinds of lists that we can create. One kind of list we can create is an unordered list, and another kind of list we can create is an ordered list. So an unordered list always starts with a UL tag, ends with a UL tag, and then inside of that we've got multiple list item tags. That's what LI is short for, list item. So we've got 4 items in here. First one's JavaScript, PHP, Java, C#. These are unordered, so there's not any. We're not saying that there's an order to that. Generally speaking, unordered lists will show up with bullet points. Versus ordered lists, we got enter your billing information, enter your shipping information, confirm your order. Well, these have you have to do step A, and then step B, and then step C. So these typically come with numbers. So an OL, an ordered list, will show up with numbers normally. An unordered list will typically show up with bullets like this. Now, you can change both of those things. You can change these to be letters. You can change this to be ABC. You can change this to Roman numerals. You can change these to circles or discs or squares or whatever you want to. Through CSS, you can change the way those look. In fact, you can make an unordered list look like an ordered list, an ordered list look like an unordered list. But what's important is the semantics. In an unordered list, there's no meaning to the order, right? It's just I put these in an unordered list. You're saying I put these in. The order doesn't really matter. In an ordered list, you're saying I put these in this order, and that order matters. That's what it means semantically. So this, by default, without any CSS applied, that's how those two things are going to look. An unordered list is going to have dots, and an ordered list is going to have numbers like that. Okay. Another kind of list that we can create, which is new in HTML5, is something called a definition list. So it starts with a DL and it ends with a DL tag. But inside of there, we have two kinds of tags. We have a DT for definition term and DD for definition description. Okay, so what it's meant for is saying, here's a term, here's a description, here's a term, here's a description. It's actually used for a lot of things beyond that because it's a generally useful thing. It's generally useful for anytime you have like, okay, here's a thing, and here's a thing that goes with it. So for instance, sometimes people will use these for forms where you have the label in the DT and the actual field in the DD. So the general way that that looks is usually you'll have the DT is over on the left, and then each of the DTs is indented a little bit underneath the underneath the term. Okay. So that's what a definition list might look like. I know that one of your labs, I think, asks you to create one that way. Okay. Let's talk about the inline image element. So an image element, we can define it as such, and we start with IMG. Okay. SRC is how we specify what image we want to display. That's one thing that's really, really important to remember. Remember when we were looking at links, I kind of skimmed over this, but when you're looking at links, href is the name of the property that we use to specify where the link goes. Okay. Now with images, it's source, SRC. Okay. Don't ask me for the history of why those two things are different. It's been that way since the 90s and probably not ever going to change. So images use source and links use href. So that's what it is. So source is the file that we want to show in the image. Alt is text that we want to display if the image is not available. So if the image doesn't show up, then use Murach logo as the text instead. Now, another important thing with the alt attribute. The alt attribute is used by screen readers. For anybody that's blind or hard of seeing, it will read that alt text in place of the image. Okay, it'll read that alt text in place of the image. That's important. We're also giving it a height to say, well, this should be 75 pixels tall. So that's one way to change the size of the image. As we go further on into the semester, it will be better to do height and width through CSS once you learn how to do that. But up until that point, you can set the width and the height through HTML attributes. Okay. So this is what that looks like, right? So we have our image, which is showing up here, and then we have our text that's showing up below. Now, a general guideline when you're working with images, there are three formats of images that are broadly supported by most browsers. At this point, really, all browsers can support these three types of images. Okay, so the first one is PNG images. Second one would be JPEG. Third one would be GIF or GIF, whatever you want to call it. So PNGs, important things to know about them. They do support transparency. So part of the image can be transparent with a PNG. You can have as many colors as you want, and they are compressed. They do work, but they're relatively lossless compression. Okay, usually don't lose much in the way of image data from them. They work really well for graphics and images that have been created in programs that have been created artificially. So for instance, this works really, really well as a PNG, and it's compressed pretty well when you work with that. On the other hand, JPEGs do not support transparency, but they're really good for images. They're really good for natural images. Anything you would go out and take a picture of something, it's probably with your camera, it's or your phone or whatever, it's a good fit for a JPEG. You can read this article to see a little bit more about what some of that means, but JPEG does a pretty good job of compressing images, and that's what it's designed for. It is lossless compression, so if you're not careful with how you compress your JPEGs, you will see compression artifacts, you will see errors in them. So that's something to keep in mind. So usually use JPEGs for photos. Usually use PNGs for other kinds of graphics. And then you also, sometimes you want a GIF. Well, GIFs support animation. However, they are limited to 256 colors, which means they generally make for some pretty ugly photos. You'll notice a few articles in here, especially some dithering here right behind his head, because it has to take the original image and turn it into that 256 color palette. So that's one thing that you're going to note is you're not going to get high quality images with GIF, but they do support animation. All right. Just a few accessibility guidelines for images. One is you want to make sure you always include an alt attribute. Whatever the image is, it should always have an alt attribute. So that alt attribute generally should describe what's in the image, especially if it's important to the content of the page. It should give some explanation of what that image is. Because that alt will use it in one of two ways, or one or both in two ways. It will use if the image cannot be found, if the image is lost or missing or whatever, that alt will be shown in place of the image. That alt text will be shown there instead, and it will be used by screen readers, which for people that are hard of seeing, so that they have some idea of what's there. If the image is just for decoration, right? So like you would prefer that if a screen reader hit it, the screen reader should just skip over it. Then you should set an alt attribute, but set it to empty string, just double quotes. That way you're saying, okay, it's here, but I'm acknowledging that the screen reader shouldn't do anything with it. Okay, so here's an example, a simple web page of how you might throw all these things together. We've got an image, we've got some headers, we've got an unordered list, we've got some text down here, which is contact information, so you can see this part is emphasized, and then you've also got some entities, so like copyright. Copyright is an entity down here. So let's look at the website, the HTML that might be behind this page. Okay, so if I look at that, we're going to start up at the top. Okay, well, we've got the head first. Remember, the head is stuff that's not shown on the page. So I have the title, San Juan Valley Town Hall. Okay, so I can see that up here. The shortcut icon, okay, favicon.ico. All right, I can see that there. And maybe I can pull this up in Visual Studio. This may actually be easier to look at through there. So File, Open Folder. This is Chapter 3. Murach. Okay, Book Apps, Chapter 3. There we go, Town Hall. Let's select that. And let's run that in the browser. Let's look at that side by side. Okay, so we can look at a few of these things. So first of all, I can see it looks like they've actually, contrary to what they showed in the slides, looks like they've they have put images. They have put favicon in the images folder. Now, this is one thing that they've done. This is actually not technically correct. So you can reference your favicon like this. For some browsers, this works sometimes. Your favicon.ico actually, per best practices, is actually should be in the root of your website. So it should actually be down here with your path pointing to it like so. Did that work? There, I did have to do a Control F5 to get it to reload it. So your best practice is considered to always put your ICO at the root, your favicon.ico at the root of your website. Okay, so we should do that. Down here now, so we've got, all right, the title, we've got the favicon, header, so that would be this upper section here. So that has, all right, images / logo.gif. Okay, that's this. And then we can see if that image is not available. So for instance, if I flub the URL, you can see that it shows the alt text instead. But you can see, at least with the current version of Chrome, that doesn't show up as a tooltip. So let's say I wanted this text town hall logo to show up as tooltip. I might add a title here and say town hall logo. Okay. So that is, so I might do that, and that would give me a tooltip. So if I at least hover over the image, then it'll show me that. That can be helpful with a lot of images to add that tooltip. We're specifying the width as 50. If I say, let's take this off, let's see what happens without the width being set to 50. As you can see, it's not actually doing anything right now. I think that would be down to, oh, no, it did do something. So let's say I want to make it smaller. I could go down to a width of 10. Let's say I want to make it a lot bigger. I go up to a width of 200. Now you can see if I go up to a larger size, you can see that I get a lot of artifacts as I make that image larger. So generally it's okay to make images smaller. You usually can't see it, although recognize that it's still, the file size is still fixed by the actual size of the file. So making an image smaller this way doesn't really save you on bandwidth. So if you want to make an image smaller, you usually want to go do it in an image editor, but you can do it this way. But making images larger is usually not something you want to do this way. Usually you need to start with an image that's actually larger to begin with. Okay. So beneath that, we've got an H2, San Juan, San Joaquin Valley Town Hall, another H3, bringing cutting edge speakers to the value. So that's the main header of the page as well as its kind of subtitle. Okay. And beneath that, we have what's the main content of the page. So the main content of the page includes an H1, and then within there, there's some navigation. So this nav is another semantic tag that kind of says, okay, this part is a way to navigate to different parts of the website. So this is going to send us to the speaker page for Jeffrey Toobin. We've got a link for, the speaker in November, January, February, March, April, etc. So we've got a page for each speaker each month. Beneath that, then we also have this. We can see it's a paragraph inside there. It's making that part italic with the EM. And then finally, the footer is this copyright with the entity symbol, right? So that's a relatively simple small page, and you can already see that it's starting to accumulate a lot of code. So as your projects start getting more advanced and you start building bigger website, just recognize that your code will grow. So following some best practices along the way can really help you, especially as your projects get bigger. So that's all of the HTML for that page. Here's an example of maybe what might look like if you were to build out that speaker page. I think one of the lab exercises, one of the book exercises asks you to do that. Namely short 3.1. So if you want to get an example of how to do this yourself, I would go through short exercise 3.1, and that will kind of guide you through creating this page, creating it with actual HTML and structuring it. So to kind of rehash and refresh on what we've looked at in this lesson here, we've talked about how to properly structure your HTML web pages, your web pages with HTML, and use some of the semantic elements that were introduced in HTML5. We talked about absolute and relative URLs and paths, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of using different ones. We talked about the title and some of the meta elements that you can put in the head section. There are a lot of different kind of meta elements, and that could be an entire lesson on itself, just talking about all the meta elements that you can put in the head. So there are a lot of those. We also talked about a little bit about block elements, inline elements. Remember, block elements do separate, do cause a line break. So they do typically appear vertically stacked, whereas inline elements allow you to apply styling in line to text without breaking it into multiple lines. Okay. We talked about a few common block elements, including H1, H2, goes all the way down to H3, H6. We talked a little bit about the paragraph tag as well as the div tag. All of those are block elements. We talked about inline elements, including BR. BR allows you to break text in the middle and say, well, I want this to break into 2 lines. Typically, what I would encourage you to use div tags or paragraph tags instead when you intend to break text. BR tags do work, but they're not really good in terms of semantics. BR tags, by the way, are empty tags if you're using them. EM for emphasis, strong for making things louder, typically makes things bold, and span tags for just general styling. We talked about entity symbols, including NBSP for non-breaking space, copy for copyright. We talked about AMP for ampersand, and we talked about some of the quote entity symbols as well. We talked about some of the core attributes in HTML, including the ID attribute, the class attribute, and the title attribute. We talked a little bit about how to use the div and the span elements for modern websites to kind of structure the page. Remember that you only want to use those div and span where one of the other semantic elements doesn't make more sense. We talked about how to use some of the HTML5 semantic elements, including header, main, footer. If you look through your chapter, I think it will talk about section, article, nav, and aside a little bit more. I don't think those aren't really on the slides. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to use the figure and figure caption. We talked about distinguishing and using absolute versus relative URLs, and we talked about root relative URLs versus document relative paths. Root relative paths versus document relative paths. We talked about anchor tags, which are used to create links, as well as image tags, which are used to display images directly in the page. And we talked about some of the accessibility guidelines for both using anchor tags as well as image tags. And then we looked at a few different kinds of lists, including unordered lists, ordered lists, and then finally talking about the definition list as well. Okay. So there are some more reading assignments on perusal, as well as your homework and lab assignments for Chapter 3 are up on Insight Rankin. All right. So that's the end of this lecture here. I'll hit you up again next week where we'll start on Chapter 4. All right. Thank you.